We're on the lookout for sponsors to join us on our incredible journey with Inspired Change with Gunter. If your organisation cares deeply about meaningful conversations around masculinity, self-development and mental health, we'd love to partner with you. Our podcast has a wonderful, dedicated audience committed to personal growth and positive social change. By sponsoring Inspired Change with Gunter, your brand will connect with listeners who truly value thoughtful discussion and support initiatives that promote real transformation. We're incredibly proud to be ranked number 1 in Australia and number 5 in the USA on FeedSpot's top men's mental health podcasts. For more information on how to become a sponsor, please reach out to Miranda Spigener-Sapon, our showrunner and executive producer. We'd love to explore how we can work together to inspire change. Now, thank you for your continued support, and let's keep inspiring change together.
You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter. Yes, I am back. And so before we really get going today, I want to take a moment to acknowledge 2 people who've been absolutely essential to keeping the show going in my absence. Yes, only 1 episode, but it may happen again. And those 2 people are Miranda Spigener-Sapon and DeVonna Prinzi. These 2 women stepped up and held this community together with real dedication and care. And I'm genuinely grateful to them both. If you've been listening while I've been away, you already know what I mean. So Miranda, DeVonna, thank you. So let's get started. And let's get into it. I just want to point out that the views that I express here are my own. And this podcast is for informational and educational purposes. It is not therapy. It is not, necessarily intended for you to up sticks and make huge life changes. This is about your inner journey more than it is anything external. And if you've been with me for a while, you know that means that I go through the research and we don't just swap opinions. Some things that I say are mostly factual because they're based on evidence, science. And not, I might have some opinions about some stuff, but, generally speaking, those opinions are formed and formulated through my, education in history, philosophy, psychology, sociology, anthropology, a lot of reading, not just online. It's not YouTube related. It is getting stuck into real stuff. Okay? So, having said that, my last episode, so the one before Miranda and DeVonna, who did a great job in talking about things like the importance of rest and that, essentially perfectionism is a pain in the ass which will stall you from really getting into anything and completing it. So those sort of things I think are certainly worth looking at because they in many respects also have their roots in patriarchy. And you might sound surprised. And I'm actually thinking about doing a particular episode based on what Miranda and DeVonna were talking about and expounding it, filling it in more with, the Making Good Men great philosophy and model. But something pricked my attention earlier this week, both within my practice, but also in terms of some of the stuff that I've been reading and listening to and watching. And essentially, it is a topic very dear to my heart because I've done a podcast on this before, but I want to pick up on it. I'm hoping that this time round, with a Patreon exercise, I'm going to be able to help people really take a look at their own sort of process in this. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about why men are lonely. And I'm not just talking about on a weekend or, you got a day off in the midweek. But I'm talking about it structurally, chronically. I argue that we've built a culture that just doesn't just fail to address that. My argument is that in many ways it actually produces it. So today I want to talk about the male friendship crisis. And especially what the Australian data shows. There's some stuff from overseas which I'm not going to get into here today because I want to do a bit more of a deep dive into that. I want to know what's happening, why it's happening. And in part of this, I'm going to be drawing directly on the framework from my book, Making Good Men Great, Surfing a New Masculinity, the second edition, which you can order from the various outlets, and there'll be a little plug at the end. And the reason why I'm using that is because they are central to understanding the mechanisms behind this. Okay, so I talk in that book about 5 pillars of patriarchy. I also want to point out the loneliness cost. Being lonely, chronically, structurally, is costing our culture, our society, a lot. Not just on an individual basis. So what sort of information have we got? What actually is happening? So as I said, I'm going to keep this confined to Australia at the moment, but I'm pretty sure that if I go to the UK, in fact I know, if I go to the UK and the United States, similar issues. Now some of you might be going, yeah, but, I have my mates, we cycle together, we go for surf trips to the Maldives, all that sort of thing. I'll come back to that. Because you're right, you're probably doing that. But not every bloke does that. So, the data in Australia tells us that the average Australian male has fewer than 2 close friends. Now, I'm not talking contacts, I'm not talking colleagues, not someone you have a beer with at a work event. I'm talking about really close friends, the sort of blokes that you'd call if something in your life went south and something really went wrong. I'm talking about people who really know what's actually happening to you. So, less than 2, less than 2. And that average conceals a significant portion of men who have absolutely none. The Jesuit Social Services Man Box research, and if you're not across that work, I'd encourage you to find it. It's some of the most rigorous Australian research we have on masculine norms and their consequences, found that over a third of young Australian men reported feeling lonely. That's crucial. It's also really important because those who most strongly endorsed rigid definitions of masculinity were in fact the ones most socially isolated. So when we talk about the manosphere, that has nothing to do with male friendship. In fact, I would argue that in many respects, it will create a rift between men. So that's not a coincidence. That is a pattern with a mechanism behind it, and I'm going to name that mechanism directly. So you might be going, well, this is just about getting a quantity of friends. You know, we go out shopping, we pick, 5 apples here and 3 pears there. No. The other question is it simply that men have fewer friends than they used to? Not entirely, because it's also about depth. The research consistently shows that male friendships tend to be activity-based. As I said, surf trips to Maldives, cycling on the weekend, whatever, football, soccer, right? And so essentially you're mates because you play a sport together. Now, on a darker day, I will go, well, it's a bit like having, people that you do drugs with. Okay? You have a good time, everyone's happy, then you go and part your own way, but no one really gets to know each other. When I was working in drug and alcohol, I used to have chats with my clients about bong buddies. Initially they laughed, and then after a while, as they're going through recovery, they realised what I was talking about. Same with the beer culture. So, let's come back to the structural stuff. So you're mates because you play a sport together. You work together, you grew up in the same suburb. Remove the activity and the friendship often doesn't survive it. What's largely absent is disclosure-based connection. The kind where you actually say what's going on in your life, what you're worried about, what you need, where you want to go. And here's the health reality with this. And I want to be clear that this is not a soft topic. Beyond Blue tells us that 1 in 8 Australian men experience depression. And that men are significantly less likely than women to seek support. We know that. A lot of my research and reading, keeps coming back to this fact, and I'm looking at producing some work that helps to explain this at a much deeper level. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data shows that men die younger than women across virtually every major cause of death, and that social isolation is a consistent contributing factor. Loneliness activates chronic stress and elevates cortisol, and if you listened to early episodes on cortisol and longevity, you know exactly what prolonged cortisol elevation does to the male body. Now, I don't simply have an abstract academic or clinical experience of this. My father, who was generally speaking, from where I saw it, a very social guy. He was very physically active, great swimmer, he was a scuba diving instructor, so he seemed to have a lot of people in his life. But fundamentally, there was an element of loneliness with my dad, especially, through his relationship with my mother, and in fact, because he was like a lot of men and refused to actually seek help adequately, he passed away unnecessarily from sepsis. A very sad experience for all of us concerned. And so the reason why I'm pointing that out is that this hits home. This is close to home. So when I describe the male friendship crisis as a public health issue, I mean that exactly, precisely. This is not about men feeling a bit flat. It is about measurable, preventable harm. So why do you think this is happening? This is the part where the easy answers actually don't get traction. You'll often hear that men are just stoic by nature and that they prefer independence, that closeness isn't really how men operate. Now, I'm going to push back on that because it's fundamentally rubbish. Not because it's insulting, but because the research actually doesn't support it. What the evidence supports is a social and developmental explanation. These patterns are learned, which means they can be unlearned, but only if you understand where they come from. And this is where I come back to the 5 pillars of patriarchy that I lay out in Making Good Men Great, Surfing a New Masculinity. Because it is important to name something explicitly. If it's abstract, we can't get much done around that. Because each one of those pillars in its own is working against the conditions that make genuine male friendship possible. Now, let me do a bit of a rerun. The first is territoriality. In the book, I describe how patriarchal culture assigns emotional states by sex. Men are allocated control, stoicism, and rationality, while vulnerability, care, and emotional openness gets assigned to women and coded as weakness in men. This creates what I call emotional territoriality. Men learn early that expressing fear, sadness, uncertainty, or need is a breach of their emotional territory. And real friendship, not mateship, not camaraderie, but genuine closeness, requires exactly those things. It requires the capacity to say, here is what I'm struggling with. When that's been trained out of a man over 30, 40, 50 years, he doesn't just choose not to say it. Often he no longer has reliable access to that inner space. The second is hierarchy. Patriarchal systems are built around who is above and who is below. And friendship, real friendship, requires a degree of mutuality, equity, or equality. It requires being willing to be in need, to be less certain, to admit you don't have it all together. In a framework where social worth is determined by where you sit in the hierarchy, admitting vulnerability is admitting to the fact that you've slipped down a notch. Now, in primate studies, we know that this is the trigger for a primate to get depressed. The Man Box research shows that Australian men who most strongly endorse those hierarchical norms are the most likely to police each other's behaviour, to call out softness, to ridicule emotional disclosure. The cost of openness in male peer culture is real. And men learn that very early. The third is acquisition. When a man's identity and worth are tied to what he accumulates, like career, achievement, status, property, position, friendships become a luxury he can't justify. Time, availability, emotional presence, these are the raw materials of a close friendship. They're also the things that acquisition imperative treats as expendable in the pursuit of external markers of success. In the book, I look at how this plays out in men's lives and how they move through the 30s and 40s. The years when friendship erosion is most acute, where it's precisely these years when men are most invested in building and demonstrating achievement. Remember, the relationship in masculinity and patriarchy between competence and worth. The fourth is competition. Patriarchal culture uses competition not just as a motivational tool, but as a way of dividing men from each other. Now, in some respects, I've seen that very clearly acted out in the surf. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but if any surfer out there is open and honest with themselves, they know exactly what I mean. When the dominant frame in male relationship is comparison and one-upmanship, the ground for genuine closeness disappears. The Man Box research found that young Australian men were significantly more likely to say they felt that they couldn't be honest about their struggles because they worried about how they'd be judged by other men. Extraordinary, isn't it? But it's part of the fabric. So competition fundamentally devalues the very things that friendship requires: empathy, cooperation, and a genuine interest in someone else's experience. The fifth pillar is combativeness. This is the warrior stance, the disposition towards the world that treats vulnerability as exposure and openness as a liability. In the book, I describe how this plays out, not just in the obvious aggression, but in the subtler habit of never letting a guard down, or always having an answer, of staying defended. It's even built into our body posture, the bringing the chest out, squaring shoulders, the stance, the positioning of oneself where I might be slightly above the other person. The body language actually speaks often louder than the words. It's the man who changes the subject just as things are getting real. It's the response that turns a difficult conversation into a practical problem to be solved. Combativeness keeps men in a permanent posture of self-protection, which makes depth in relationships almost structurally impossible. And if you think this is only sort of out there, in the general world, ask yourself the question of what we do when we're in therapy, both as a client, but also if we are the therapist. We often slip in very quickly to the fix-it mode in order to make ourselves feel better. It's got often little to do with the client. It also projects a professional level of expertise and knowledge and authority, and a certain gravitas that comes with that environment. More of that another time. So the question is, what does this actually cost? So again, for a world that runs on cost benefits analysis, return on investment, sort of got to talk about this, but it also actually is really important. So we've covered the physical dimension, but there's Australian data on male depression which is very clear. Men experience depression differently from women, and that's often forgotten. Where women more often present with low mood, sadness and withdrawal, men are more likely to present with irritability, risk-taking, substance use and emotional numbing. Right? A good example of that is the sort of grumpy old man. Okay, so when you're 35 and that's how you're presenting, it probably would be worthwhile to sitting down with somebody and whether that's your GP or a counsellor or a therapist, it's worth checking out. Because those presentations don't match our cultural picture of what depression looks like, they go unrecognised by clinicians, by partners, and often by the guys themselves. Beyond Blue has been documenting this pattern for years, and it remains one of the most significant barriers to men getting support when they need it. Now, I've got another pitch on this, which I at some point might even write a paper about, and that is psychotherapy was developed by men for women. I'm not saying deliberately, it's just sort of how it panned out. So a large amount of historical data and frameworks are based on the male experience of a woman coming to him as a patient or a client. And that bias has persisted. So my argument is essentially, gender is always in the consultation room. And we really need to keep that in focus. So social isolation amplifies this whole entire dynamic. When friendships are not there, when there's no one who would notice this shift, who would ask the harder questions, like, how are you? Oh yeah, okay. No, really, how are you? A friend who would simply sit with a man in difficulty. The symptoms have nowhere to go. They compound, they become chronic. And the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data on male suicide rates reflects this completely. Australian men are 3 times more likely than Australian women to die by suicide. 3 times. And while the causes, could be argued are complex, social disconnection is one of the most consistently identified risk factors because of the lack of actual open connection. There's also something worth naming about identity that tends not to be discussed. Close friendship is one of the primary ways human beings regulate their sense of self. The people who know us well, who hold a consistent picture of who we are across time, serve a genuinely stabilizing function. Without that, without people who can say, that's not like you, or something's changed about you, right? Men can gradually lose contact with who they actually are outside of their roles and functions. In other words, there can be a fragmentation of the sense of self. Now, this very clearly shows up in transitions. Australian men who go through separation, divorce, redundancy, retirement, or significant illness without strong friendship networks are considerably more vulnerable to depression, cognitive decline, and early mortality than those with intact, close social connections. The friendship network is a buffer. When it isn't there, the system is exposed. And then there's the direct connection back to the last episode's theme, the one that I did. When men are isolated and disconnected, they look for a community. That's not a character flaw, it's a human need. The problem at the moment is that the communities most aggressively recruiting, especially isolated young Australian men, are not necessarily healthy. Online spaces that offer a sense of identity, belonging, and shared purpose, but they do it through a grievance and ideology, answer the loneliness in ways that tend to produce more damage than the loneliness itself. The Man Box research again speaks directly to this. Young Australian men who most strongly endorse rigid masculine norms were both the most socially isolated and the most likely to hold hostile attitudes towards women. Or, I'm going to take another step, anyone who's different. So loneliness and ideology here are not separate problems. They feed each other. So what do we do about this? Now, I want to be direct about something first because the standard advice on this topic frustrates me. Join a club, be vulnerable, just reach out. It's not that those suggestions are wrong, it's that they're incomplete, they're shallow. They locate the entire problem in individual behaviour and ignore conditions that make friendship difficult for men in the first place. And those conditions, as we've spent the last 20 minutes exploring, are social, they're structural, economic, political. So let me offer 2 things. The first one is structural. Any institution that creates regular recurring contact between men around shared purpose creates the conditions for friendships to develop. This is what the research on male friendship consistently shows. Closeness is built through proximity and repetition over time. So, part of that is get out of the digital space and get analog. It's not also just simply through a breakthrough conversation. It's being there, it's showing up in the same place for the same reason repeatedly over months and years. And this, in part, is why places like the men's shed, Freemasonry, and I know that's got a bad connotation or connotations, but it was something that men did regularly. They came to a monthly meeting, shared space, shared ritual, so it connected them. And, unfortunately, in some places it didn't go deep enough, but in some it did. The second is more personal, and I want to name it carefully because I know this territory can feel uncomfortable. Men don't need to become someone else to build closer friendships. They don't need a personality transplant. They don't need to adopt a communication style that feels foreign. What the evidence suggests is considerably more modest. Show up consistently, engage in shared contact, and gradually, without forcing it, allow a little more of your actual experience into the conversation. That's the work. Not a sudden embrace of vulnerability, not performing emotional openness. Consistency, shared purpose, and incrementally more honesty becomes the glue for two people or more people to connect together. One more thing is worth naming. The 5 pillars, territoriality, hierarchy, acquisition, competition, and combativeness, are not fixed features of what it means to be a man. In fact, they're features of what it is to be patriarchal or to be indoctrinated in the patriarchal ideology. They're also historical constructions. In Surfing a New Masculinity, I'll make this argument at length. These values were built into the culture. Now, the positive is that means that they can be changed by the culture. But they change when men begin to name them, to see them operating in their own lives and to make different choices about what they're willing to live by. That's not a small thing. And it may be, in fact, one of the most important things. So, bringing this podcast to a close for the moment, let's accept the male friendship crisis is real. But it's not inevitable. What I wanted to leave you with today is this. Needing connection is not weakness. It's one of the most well-documented predictors of health, longevity, and psychological stability that we have. So you can pump all the, longevity supplements, all the, adjusted lifestyle, organic foods, not drinking alcohol. But when those elements that I've just talked about are not there, all that stuff goes up in a puff of smoke. Now, I'm not saying, you can eat junk food, get pissed every night, do drugs, and party till, the first rays of sunlight. That's not what I'm talking about. Let's be sensible here. What we want is to understand that building and maintaining close friendships is not soft. It's some of the most important work a man can do for his own life. So if today landed for you, I'd invite you to do one concrete thing. Think about a friendship in your life that has quietly drifted and reach out, not to fix everything, not to have a big conversation, but just reconnect. Because that's where it starts. Now, for those of you who are Patreon Members, this week's exercise will take you through essentially an honest audit of your actual friendship landscape. Not what you'd like it to look like, but what it genuinely is right now. Be honest with yourself. Be transparent. So this has been Inspire Change with Gunter. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep questioning what we're being told.
You know, on this show, we talk a lot about living with purpose, slowing down, paying attention, and being intentional about the choices we make every day. Because when we simplify the noise around us, we can better hear what really matters. Empathy, connection, and showing up as the best version of ourselves. That's why I'm genuinely pleased to welcome our newest sponsor, Distill Union. Their philosophy aligns beautifully with what we do here. Distill Union creates slick, thoughtfully designed essentials, wallets, key organizers, phone cases, all built with a less is more approach. Their Wally wallets, Ferris key organizers, these are everyday tools that make life easier, cleaner, and calmer. In that simplicity, there's space for clarity. There's space for change. As a thank you to our Inspire Change community, they're offering 20% off any product with the promo code INSPIRECHANGE. Have a look, try them out, and see how simplifying your day can open the door to something deeper. Visit distillunion.com and enjoy 20% off any product with the promo code INSPIRECHANGE. That's distillunion.com with promo code INSPIRECHANGE to check out.
Hello to all our listeners. We thank you for tuning in and supporting positive social change, which makes you a part of Gunter's efforts in transforming not only men's lives, but lives in general. And we are grateful that you have joined us. This week, our shout out goes to Virginia Beach for bringing Virginia to number 7 on our top 10 USA listeners list. And for our global listeners, we want to shout out to our listeners in Quito for bringing Ecuador to number 14 on the top 20 listeners list. Congratulations! We thank you so much for your continued support as we appreciate your efforts toward positive social change. I, DeVonna Prinzi, the co-executive producer, and our showrunner, Miranda Spigener-Sapon, sincerely thank you and ask that you please take the time to like, follow, subscribe, and share as your efforts make a difference to everyone here at Inspire Change with Gunter. If these stories resonate with you and you would like to engage more with Gunter and the Inspire Change team, please consider joining our Patreon community, where our members find bonus content and early access to video episodes. Membership awaits at patreon.com/Inspire Change. That's patreon.com/INSPIRECHANGE. As always, thank you to each and every one of our listeners. And most importantly, please keep inspiring positive social change.
Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.GunterSwoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com.